Good morning and welcome on this third Sunday of Advent. This is the Mouse King that we're getting into today, who is the villain of the Nutcracker story. Christmas can have a dark side. When John's Gospel tells of Jesus' origin, we hear that Jesus is a light that shines in the darkness. Joseph must have been anxious when he discovered that Mary was pregnant because an angel had to tell him in a dream, "Do not be afraid to take Mary as a wife." When Jesus is born, Herod becomes so fearful that he goes on a murderous rampage throughout Judea. The gospel is called the good news because we are all too familiar with news being bad. Maybe there's a bit of Mouse King in all of us, something within us that is more comfortable with the darkness than we care to admit. While Clara sleeps under the Christmas tree, she notices a mouse, not only slinking toward her, but towering over her. It is frightening to see something large that is supposed to be small. Think of old 1950s monster movies. The trend was to imagine innocuous creatures as gigantic, movies like The Tarantula, Godzilla, or The Blob. On the surface, a spider, a lizard, a shapeless goo aren't scary at all, because we are normally much larger in comparison. When the spider is suddenly bigger than we are, there seems to be little hope. Being small, weak, and outnumbered seems to be a primal fear deep within our being. Maybe this is why we feel hopeless sometimes in the face of the many sins of the world. Homelessness, poverty, inequality. These seem to be almost too big for us to even begin to take on. At first glance, these problems seem too large for any one person to handle. And on one hand, they are exactly that, because we are called to be one body working together to build God's kingdom. We aren't called to face these alone. On the other hand, these problems may not be as large as we think. Perspective matters. We cannot end poverty without being ministry with the poor. We cannot end homelessness without being in ministry with the homeless. We cannot welcome a stranger without being in ministry with the immigrants. This is one of the reasons God put on flesh and was born in a lowly manger to poor, humble parents and sent running to be refugees in another country. In a way, Jesus is God up close. Through Christ, God changes our perspective on what it means to be powerful or blessed or righteous. As we move closer to Christmas, God's story begins to strip away palaces, borders, and earthly powers. God's story begins with humanity and the divine walking together in the garden. Then God led the ancient Israelites as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. God was in the tabernacle, wandering with the chosen people. Then the Israelites wanted a king, like the other nations had. The space between God and humanity was then filled with rulers and an economy that valued some over others. When leaning into Advent, we get the sense that the space between God and humanity grows increasingly smaller. We trade soldiers for shepherds, Jerusalem for Bethlehem, and rulers for rural peasants. It's like God is trying desperately to walk in the garden with us. And the only way to do that is to topple the walls, tear down the borders, and trade a crown of gold for a crown of thorns. Now, in keeping with the topic of perspective, when the space between us and God is small, the problems of the world don't seem nearly as large. When we look at the world from a distance, things aren't always what they seem. God's movement toward us in Jesus is divine permission to move closer to one another, especially those who have been left out. But what happens when we move in close and the problems are bigger than we are? It could be that Clara is just imagining the mice are larger than herself, but it seems real enough. When there seems to be little hope is precisely when the Nutcracker wakes up. The bugle has sounded. The battle begins. The Nutcracker's army and the Mouse King's henchmen are locked in a back and forth battle. It's not quite clear what they're fighting about. Does the Mouse King perceive Clara as a threat? Is he so evil that any hint of innocence has to be vanquished? Knowing what you're fighting for is important, but even a vague purpose doesn't make the battle any less real. Out of nowhere, a mouse, larger and uglier than the others, appears, and Clara realizes this crowned mouse looks just like the one in the puppet show. Could it be the puppet show has come to life? Will the puppet show's happy ending be the ending she will experience? When you're surrounded by mice twice your size, there's little time to ponder. The Nutcracker springs into action, but it doesn't take long before he and Clara realize they are outnumbered. Suddenly, a bugle sounds, and there is from the Christmas tree, and several toy soldiers come to their aid. One thing I love about the Christmas story is that it's not something you keep to yourself. You can't keep it to yourself. The story itself calls people together. The angels tell the shepherds to go and see the child. Wise men from the east traverse afar to see the child king. The Christmas story itself is evangelistic. It's meant to be shared. Oh, come, let us adore him, the hymn invites us to sing together. Now, Advent hymns are few and far between, and the ones we find in the hymnal aren't usually topping Billboard charts. Often when we think about Advent, we talk about the season of personal preparation. And it is that, but sometimes we miss that it is not something you can do all alone. It is a time of communal hospitality. Love is on its way to us in the form of a vulnerable baby, born to first-time parents. And that is something we must share, something that should change us, something that alters our perception. Paul announces in Romans 10:15, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring the good news. The announcement of the good news is certainly joyful, but be sure to check the footnote. Paul is quoting Isaiah 52:7, one of the many verses we like to read during Advent. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation. This messenger is one who will prosper and astonish many. He shall startle the nations, and kings will shut their mouths in his presence. This messenger, as Isaiah goes on to say, has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities, for he was cut off from the land of the living. This Christ child, who came to announce God's good news for the world, is also the one who died and rose again so that we might find abundant life and resurrection. Grace is freely offered, but receiving this grace, walking with it, sharing it with one another and the world means that our love for the things that distract us from God's love must be crucified with Christ. Maybe this is why the angel announcing the good news calls for the shepherds to have no fear. It's fearful to let go of the things that make us comfortable, even at the expense of others. But to change our perspective to God's perspective, we must let go of our affluence, our selfishness, our addictions, our greed, whatever it is that holds us back from seeing each other, the world, Christmas, and the resurrection through God's perspective. Something to think about as we enter into the Christmas season, focusing on God's perspective and not our own. Amen.